Hey, this is Kez, and this is Season 2 of Nightmares at Midnight. Before this episode even starts, I want to give you a trigger warning that this episode talks about murder, gore, blood, and weapon use. Proceed at your own transgression. All right, welcome back to Season 2. There's going to be some same things, there's going to be some new things. Before we jump into it, I do have to give the typical spiel that I did in Season 1 of where you can find us and listen to us. If you're listening to us already, chances are you kind of know the places you can go, or you have your special place that you like to listen to podcasts at. Mine is typically Spotify. I listen to Amazon Music a lot as well, which we are on both of those. And those two, you can click to follow us and get notified when I release episodes. You can also go to our website, which is nightmaresatmidnightpodcast.buzzsprout.com. Follow us on Instagram. I'm trying to get a lot better at posting at least a little more often about the episodes. I am going to start posting videos of me recording so you can just see kind of what that's like. You can follow us on Facebook at Nightmares at Midnight Podcast. I do post a lot on there as well. You can listen to us on Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, Podcast Index, TuneIn Plus Alexa, Podcast Addict, Podchaser, and Deezer. If you have suggestions of what you'd like to hear about, for example, this upcoming episode was suggested to me, so I wanted to make sure I covered it. You can email us at nightmaresatmidnightpodcast@gmail.com. And lastly, before we jump into about McCarthy, Alaska, jump over to patreon.com/nightmaresatmidnightpodcast. And you can check out our membership levels. So we have several levels. We have bedtime by 8 p.m., which is where you pay $3 a month. We have bedtime by 10 p.m., which is where you pay $6 a month. Bedtime at midnight, where you pay $12 a month. Do You Even Sleep, which is $24 a month. And Yep, You're a Vampire, which is where you pay $48 a month. And each of those membership levels has different benefits, different amounts of benefits, like live chats with me, exclusive content, behind the scenes content, where you can kind of learn how I do the podcast and see me do the podcast. There's some parts where you can request a topic and I'll read it individually and send it to just you, so that way you get an individual episode just from me. There's a lot of exclusive stuff that you can get by joining our memberships. So, that being said, I am going to jump right into McCarthy, Alaska. Seeking occupational therapy services for your child in the Wasilla and Palmer area and you're on a waiting list? Clinic setting just isn't cutting it? Too many options or not enough? Wild Free Kids OT may be your answer. With no wait lists and extensive training, experience working with children and adolescents with behavior issues, we offer mobile, community, and nature-based OT where it matters most. You get real results, learning alongside your child and without compromising your way of life. Give us a call at 907-215-4438 or check us out on Facebook or online, Wild Free Kids OT. This one was suggested to me because obviously I live in Alaska and I Google mapped this and I'm about 5 hours from this city, this town that's no longer a major town, McCarthy, Alaska, and its sister town, Kennecott. They're adjoining eastern Alaska towns where I'm kind of mid-Alaska, and they were famous for mining and milling history dating back to 1900. So I don't know if you remember in season 1 where Will described how to kind of picture Alaska is if you take your right hand and you tip it down. So your thumb is kind of giving a thumbs down. Then you fold your fingers in just to that knuckle there, and that's Alaska. So McCarthy is kind of almost to the point of where your thumb meets your wrist, whereas I am kind of higher up to where your first finger, not your thumb, your pointer finger knuckle is, and that's kind of where I'm at compared in Alaska there. So McCarthy is what we're talking about today, and I don't know if you guys know it or not, but there was a massacre there, and I don't typically do a bunch of murders. I'm not really a true crimer because I don't want to get the facts wrong, but this one was brought to my attention. I did a lot of research on it, watched a lot of videos, watched a lot of news about it, so I feel educated enough to be able to at least give you a version of what happened. Like I said, McCarthy and its sister town, Kennecott, they're eastern Alaska towns, and they were pretty famous with mining in the early 1900s. At the turn of the 20th century, they were flooded with prospectors, miners, and investors, and the two towns are interconnected. Kennecott was the old mill town on the northern side of McCarthy, which became the vice mining town, and as a result, the gold rush of the Klondike and the shores of Nome were in full swing. The port town of Valdez, which I haven't been to yet, but I definitely want to, was a jump-off point for many making their way inland to the interior in search of precious minerals. The Copper River and its drainages were a rich copper country. Interactions with local natives, copper tools, and jewelry told interested parties that the mineral was somewhere upriver. While the wheels were turning on creating the copper town that became Kennecott, 5 miles down the road, the idea for McCarthy was forming. A very shrewd fellow named John Barrett was homesteading 296 acres, which is a lot of land, along McCarthy Creek. He theorized that his land was the best location for a locomotive turnaround for the railroad being constructed to haul the copper ore to the port town of Cordova, Alaska. So from Cordova, the copper would be shipped to Guggenheim-owned smelters in Tacoma, Washington. So from Cordova to Washington. Barrett's theory turned out to be correct, and he leased a portion of his land to the railroad for their turnaround. When gold was found up the country in Chisana and rumors of other mineral deposits brought squatters onto Barrett's land, he divided some of the lands into leasable parcels. That is how the town of McCarthy, Alaska was born. I know that kind of seemed like the boring part, but I got to give you the history before I can tell you what happens. So McCarthy played the vice town to Kennecott's strict company policy of no booze, no brothels, no gambling, and a red light district sprung up on the banks of the creek, and to avoid Prohibition-era regulations, the railroad engineers devised a special train whistle to alert the local saloons that a U.S. Marshal was on board. So that tells you a little bit about the town right there. After the mines of Kennecott closed in 1938, McCarthy quickly became a ghost town. From what I read, it's still a frontier town, so definitely small. Where is McCarthy? So I gave you the general location, but McCarthy and its adjacent historic mill town of Kennecott are only 80 miles from the western edge of the Canadian border of the Yukon Territory. Kennecott is located on the southern edge of the Wrangell Mountain Range. So if you pull out your map, you can find that. And McCarthy sits just south at the toe end of the Kennecott and Root glaciers. One thing about Alaska is that there's glaciers and mountains everywhere. And as somebody who just recently moved to Alaska the last couple years, I know a few of the mountain ranges because I can see them out my front window. But there is many, many, many. And I feel like majority of the people that know them are locals, and they can just look and tell you what mountain range it is. Both towns are inside the Wrangell St. Elias National Park and Preserve, and the preserve aspect of the national park enables the town of McCarthy to have privately owned land and operate as an off-the-grid Alaskan frontier town. There are several other national parks in the U.S. with preserve in their title, including Denali National Park and Preserve, which is also up here. McCarthy, Alaska, averages less than 30 inches of rain annually. Snow stays year-round high up in the mountains in the park. Contrary to popular belief, not all of Alaska has snow year-round. I know on TV shows and movies that majority of the time when you see Alaska, it has snow. But for those of you that don't know, in the summertime, it does go away in some parts, and we have 24 hours of daylight. And in the wintertime, we do have 24 hours of dark. So that's a thing in multiple places in Alaska. Now, to the unfortunate murderous part. Personally living in Alaska, I've experienced some of the most up north, hickish things and some of the most scary things in my life. Yes, in some parts of Alaska, crime is the highest in the entire U.S., and a lot of people come up here and are never heard from again. Where I live, there is crime, but not as much as other parts of the state, thankfully. And here we still have to wait weeks for our mail to come, and 3+ weeks for packages to be delivered. Amazon Prime doesn't have 2-day shipping up here, that's for sure. When it comes to neighbors, though, I live in a cul-de-sac, and I do have neighbors relatively close that I'd like to say I can trust enough. Whereas some places, you can go miles and miles and miles and not have a gas station, not have another house, not have people for miles and miles. One thing that I think people forget about Alaska is it is the biggest state. If you took Alaska and you laid it over the map, it covers majority of the Midwest. It is huge. So I can drive for 5 hours and not see a single person. It's huge up here. So the folks in McCarthy, Alaska, probably also felt safe around the neighbors and strangers who showed up to wait for their mail plane. Mail gets delivered by plane, and the people who lived in the wilderness near McCarthy were bound together by their chosen lifestyle. And they enjoyed their solitary lives, but each week they looked forward to gathering with their neighbors and socializing for an hour or two while they waited for the mail plane to arrive. Everything changed on that fateful day in 1983. Mail Day would never be the same again. In 1983, Les and Flo Hegland's home in McCarthy was the gathering spot where the 22 residents at the time of the Kennecott-McCarthy area waited for the weekly mail plane. The Heglands lived near the small airstrip where the plane landed, and not only did they offer their hospitality, but they even built an addition onto their front porch where they left uncollected mail and groceries so nearby residents could drop by at their own convenience to pick up their freight. The Heglands owned the only two-way radio in the area strong enough to communicate with the outside world, and they relayed daily weather reports to the Federal Aviation Administration office in Cordova. The Hegland house was more than just a place for residents to sit and wait for the plane to arrive. Except for the mail plane pilot, the Heglands were the McCarthy residents' lone link to civilization. Tuesday, March 1st, 1983, was Mail Day. Residents of the area were mostly stranded during the long winter of 1983, and they were dependent on and looked forward to their Tuesday mail plane. McCarthy had no running water. No telephones, no electricity, except for the power provided by individual generators. Side note, that's one thing that a lot of people have up here because we frequently go without power. And the independent souls who called this remote area home had little contact with the outside world, so the weekly gathering to wait for the mail plane was a way to share news. On February 28th, the night before Mail Day, in Kennecott, 4 miles north of the McCarthy airstrip, 29-year-old Chris Richards played a board game with his neighbor, 39-year-old Lewis Hastings, an unemployed computer programmer who had moved to Alaska from California in 1980 and had only lived in Kennecott area for a year. According to Richards, the evening was unremarkable, just a friendly game between two neighbors. The following morning, as Richards cooked breakfast, Hastings again appeared at his front door. Richards assumed Hastings was on his way to meet the mail plane, and he pushed open the door and invited Hastings in for coffee. Richards then turned his back to the door while he continued cooking his meal. A moment later, Richards felt something strike his right cheek, shattering his glasses. He immediately ducked his head and then felt an object hit his head. He turned towards Hastings and saw the other man walking toward him with his rifle held high, ready to fire again. Richards grabbed Hastings and they began to struggle while Richards screamed at Hastings to stop shooting. Hastings said, "Look, you're dead already. If you'll just quit fighting, I'll make it easy for you." Richards fumbled for a knife from the sink and stabbed Hastings in the left upper chest and the right leg. Richards then fled the cabin into the waist-deep snow, wearing only socks, one slipper, a t-shirt, and light corduroy pants. And just in case you're unaware what the temperature is like, the temperature in Kennecott that morning was 10 degrees Fahrenheit, which is pretty typical for a winter March day. While Hastings fired shots at him, Richards fought his way 3/4 of a mile up a steep hill to an unoccupied cabin where he found boots, a parka, and snowshoes. He then staggered 1/10 of a mile to the southwest to the cabin of Tim and Amy Nash. Now, the Nashes were a young couple who had just gotten married on Christmas Day, so 3 months ago, and after a long honeymoon, they had only returned to the Kennecott area 2 weeks earlier. Tim and Amy bandaged Richard's wounds while he told them what had happened. Since Hastings appeared to be on his way to McCarthy, where area residents would soon be gathering to meet the mail plane, Richards and the Nashes decided to arm themselves and head to the runway and to the Hegland's home to warn the others about Hastings. Meanwhile, 52-year-old Maxine Edwards left her husband at home while she crossed the frozen Kennecott River and proceeded to the Hegland's house to await the mail plane. Flo Hegland, who was 58, and Les, who was 64, had lived in McCarthy since 1967 and were considered the unofficial postmasters by area residents. The Heglands were the heart of McCarthy, and they provided a foundation for the independent loners who called the area home. If an area resident wanted to send a message to a friend or relative, or if a relative needed to contact one of the McCarthy residents with an urgent message, it was the Heglands who sent and received these communications on their sideband radio. The Heglands and their home were central to the loosely knit community of residents within a 50-mile radius of McCarthy. So that's quite a bit of a radius. Back at their home in Kennecott, the Nashes bundled Richards onto a sled and towed it behind their snow machine as they sped toward McCarthy and the airstrip. Note, I said snow machine. Up here, they call them snow machines. They're snowmobiles, same things, same type of deal. When they reached the airstrip, they met Gary Green, a pilot and guide. So one of the news clips that I watched was Gary Green talking, and my heart broke for him as he told the story of what he went through. Green was cleaning off his airplane, and when he heard their story, he told them he had seen Hastings 20 minutes earlier heading towards the Hegland's house. Tim Nash volunteered to check on the Heglands while Gary Green warmed up his plane in preparation to fly Richards to Glen Allen, 40 minutes away. So remember that Richards had gotten shot in the eye and the back of the head, so Green was going to take him to get medical care. Green also said he would contact the troopers and request their assistance. Another point for people who have never been to Alaska is that we don't have police up here like we do in the lower 48. A lot of the time, the state troopers are in charge of large chunks of land, and it takes a long time for troopers to get from one place to another. So as Green was loading Richards into the plane, Amy Nash saw her husband running down the airstrip toward them. He had just been to the Hegland's house, where he'd smelled the aroma of gun smoke and had seen blood splattered over the interior of the house. Tim believed the Heglands were dead and said when he walked into the kitchen, he saw Hastings standing on the back porch. Nash fired at Hastings and missed, but when Hastings returned fire, he struck Nash in the right leg. The Nashes told Green to go for help, and then they made the fateful decision to stay at the airstrip to warn the others who might still be coming for their mail. Once Green took off, he radioed the incoming mail plane and told the pilot not to land at McCarthy. He then contacted the Alaska State Troopers in Glen Allen and reported the situation. Unfortunately, while Tim and Amy waited in the freezing morning air, Hastings followed a dog sled trail through thick brush back to the airstrip. He crawled up a large mound of plowed snow across the runway from the Nashes and fired 10 rounds at the newlyweds, who stood 250 yards away from him. He then walked to within 50 feet of their bodies and fired 2 more shots, and then continued to approach, firing 2 final shots into their heads. He dragged their bodies to the top of the snowbank across the runway from where they had died in an attempt to hide them in deeper snow. So, in case you weren't keeping track, 10 rounds, 2 rounds, 2 more rounds, so 14 rounds between the 2 of them. I don't understand. Soon after Hastings climbed the snowbank, 2 more area residents, Harley King and Donna Byram, arrived at the north end of the airstrip on King's snow machine. Harley King, who was 61, and his wife Jo had lived on their homestead 15 miles west of McCarthy since 1966. Jo, a well-known bush pilot and flight instructor, had flown her plane to Anchorage and was waiting for the weather to improve before flying back to McCarthy, so she was not home that fateful day, but her husband had agreed to give Donna Byram, who was 32, a ride to the airstrip. Donna, who lived between the King's home and McCarthy, was planning to fly out on the mail plane. Donna saw large blotches of blood on the snow-covered airstrip and then spotted Hastings standing on the snowbank. When they drew closer, Hastings opened fire on them. Donna was standing on the sled behind the snow machine, and she saw bullets hit the machine and King. One bullet hit Donna in the upper right arm, and King drove the snow machine as fast as he could toward the south away from Hastings, but one of Hastings' shot had broken his leg and he soon lost control. The snow machine crashed and threw Donna and King to the runway near the path leading to the Haglunds' home. Donna tried to load King back onto the sled, but Hastings was quickly approaching, and King told her he couldn't move and urged her to save herself. After a moment's hesitation, Donna fled towards the Haglunds' home. As she ran, she heard 2 shots and knew that King was dead. When she reached the Haglunds' house, she saw the front door had been kicked in, so she ran to the greenhouse and hid outside. As she huddled, shivering, she heard Hastings approach, calling out, "One not dead, one not dead." She held her injured arm and fought to stay quiet, certain she was about to die. She heard Hastings' footsteps on the porch and knew he would soon find her, but then he abruptly turned around and sped off on the Nash's snow machine. Hastings headed west on McCarthy Road, where the troopers from Glen Allen easily intercepted him by helicopter. Hastings waved to the troopers when they landed and told them he was Chris Richards and explained that Lou Hastings had gone berserk and was shooting up McCarthy. The troopers knew Richards was already in Glen Allen, though, and this man fit the description of Lou Hastings. They arrested Hastings without incident. With Hastings handcuffed and restrained in the helicopter, the troopers continued to McCarthy, where they found the bodies of Tim and Amy Nash and Harley King on the runway. They were all dead from gunshot wounds, with final kill shots to each of their heads. Inside the Haglunds' house, the troopers discovered the bodies of Les and Flo Haglund and their neighbor, Maxine Edwards, stacked in the bedroom. A bloody fur-covered silencer sat on the nightstand behind the bodies. Troopers found the injured Donna outside the greenhouse and helped her to the helicopter. She was forced to share the ride to Glen Allen with the man who had murdered her neighbors and had tried to kill her. So the question is, why did Lou Hastings go on a murderous rampage and kill his neighbors? The reason is nearly as bizarre as the crimes themselves. Hastings was an intelligent computer programmer, like I said, who had worked at Stanford University in the late 1970s, but like many people who moved to Alaska, he left the overdeveloped area where he lived in California with dreams of starting a new life in the unspoiled wilderness of Alaska. At first, he and his wife settled in Anchorage, and he started a computer service business out of his house. But by 1982, his business and marriage had failed, and he began to spend more and more time at his cabin in Kennecott. Alaska's economy was booming in 1983 due to the construction of the Trans-Alaska Oil Pipeline that carries oil from Prudhoe Bay south to the port of Valdez in Prince William Sound. The state was flush with money and in the midst of a construction boom. Hastings hated the pipeline and related development it had created, and he felt the state's newfound prosperity would ruin the lifestyle he had dreamed of when he moved to Alaska. It became his mission to destroy the pipeline. Hastings finally divulged his convoluted scheme to authorities. He had planned to arrive in McCarthy before the mail plane and kill anyone who showed up to meet the Tuesday plane. Next, he would kill the mail plane pilot and steal the plane. He then planned to fly to a pump station near the pipeline about 80 miles west of McCarthy, where he would land and rig the plane to take off again without him in it. Then he planned to steal a fuel truck and ram the pipeline while shooting at it. This action, he believed, would badly damage the pipeline, but he hoped the oil would congeal in the cold winter temperature and not do too much environmental damage. After rupturing the pipeline, he then believed the fuel truck would burst into flames and char his body beyond recognition. He hoped people would think he had been murdered in McCarthy with the other residents, and his family would never know he was a murderer who had committed suicide in the end. Lewis Hastings brutally massacred 6 people on March 1st, 1983, and wounded 2 others because he believed murdering his neighbors was a necessary first step in his brilliant plan to preserve the Alaskan wilderness. Les and Flo Hegland, Maxine Edwards, Tim and Amy Nash, and Harley King died in the McCarthy Massacre, and Chris Richards and Donna Byram were injured. The judge sentenced Hastings to 634 years in prison. As a sad footnote to this tragic story, Chris Richards, a man the surviving residents of McCarthy considered a hero because of his swift actions, had saved more people from being killed in the 1983 massacre, died when his Kennecott cabin burned down 1 week before Christmas in 2001. After his death, many who knew Richards said Hastings had finally claimed his 7th victim. Richards never recovered physically or mentally from the massacre, and in later years, survivor's guilt, depression, and alcoholism plagued him. According to those who knew him, at the time of his death, he was trying to give up alcohol and was suffering from hallucinations. The McCarthy-Kennecott area is now a popular tourist destination, but like most remote areas in Alaska, the crowds leave in September and only a few hardy individuals choose to live in such a desolate wilderness in the winter. Most of these people cherish their solitude, but they often must depend on each other to survive the long, cold winter. For the folks of the McCarthy area, it was not easy for them to trust their neighbors again after the horrible Tuesday in March 1983, and Mail Day has never been the same since. On our website and in the show notes, I added links to where you can also learn about McCarthy. I also included our Patreon. I just want to voice that this one was hard for me to do, living up here in Alaska and hearing about the unfortunate deaths of these people, knowing that they chose to live in solitude, away from their families, away from a lot of opportunity that they could have had. They chose to be up here and enjoy this lifestyle, and then for somebody to come and take it away for no reason other than their selfish beliefs and his own concern, it's heartbreaking. So I won't do a lot of the murder stories. I do like spooky, but I have a hard time when it comes to murders, stuff like that, because it's so sad. So that's what I have on McCarthy, Alaska. I hope I educated you a little bit at least on Alaska and how things are up here. And hopefully you can tune in to episode 2 next week. I'm not sharing what it is yet. You'll have to tune in to find out. Make sure to check out our website, check out our Patreon, follow us on Instagram and Facebook, and as always, catch us next time. As a busy mom, it can be hard to take care of yourself. My friend Jennifer has opportunities to solve just that. She now has a brand new storefront. Her Anchored in Relaxation storefront is here in Wasilla, Alaska at 3400 East Cottle Loop. It's in the new building on the corner of Seward Meridian and Palmer-Wasilla Highway. Her place is a great, relaxing spot to get a facial and a massage all in one location. You can find her on Facebook, square appointments, and by emailing anchoredinrelaxation@gmail.com. Mention you heard about her on my podcast and get a free peppermint scalp massage added on to any massage. Support your local veteran-owned businesses and go to Anchored in Relaxation today.